All right. Well, welcome to AACC's Flourish, a mental health webinar series that lies at the intersection of faith, mental health, and the Asian American identity or identities. In today's webinar, we're going to dive deep into the importance of the soul and its vital role in our mental and spiritual well-being. While mental health includes emotional, psychological, and social aspects, it's essential in the Christian life to also emphasize soul care. We aim to explore and understand what the soul is and highlight the importance of nurturing our soul as part of our self-care practices. My name is Ray Chang, and I serve as the president of the Asian American Christian Collaborative. I'm so thrilled to welcome our special guest, Pastor Jeff Hyun, who is going to be guiding us through this discussion. As a quick bio and overview, he is the founder of Barnabas Co, a ministry that aims to come alongside Asian American pastors and ministry leaders in order to encourage, strengthen, and provide care for their souls. They just launched the Journey of Wholeness, which is a 5-month soul care experience designed exclusively for Asian American pastors and ministry leaders. We have a lot of mutual friends, and I'm thrilled that we'll be seeing each other, Jeff, in just like a few days in Michigan. But welcome to the webinar, Jeff. So glad you're here.
Yeah, Ray, thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you to the AACC community for allowing me just to share. And thank you to everyone who's joining online for this webinar series.
Yeah, thank you everyone for being with us. Let me begin by just simply asking you a question. Like, what's the soul? What's a soul?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good question to sort of begin with, and I do have a few slides that I've kind of prepared that can, I'm kind of a visual learner, so it might kind of help to frame this in this way. So let me go ahead and just tee that up real quickly, and hopefully all of you guys can sort of see this. But I wanted to sort of lead in with this question, if you were to think about what is the most valuable or precious possession that you have, maybe some of us here would say it's our home. Maybe it's the car that we drive. Others of us who are more sentimental in nature might say something like, oh, it's like a family photo album or like a family heirloom that's been passed down from generation to generation to generation. Maybe some of us who are here that are parents, mothers and fathers might say it's actually our children. I think if we were to answer that question through the lens of scripture, I think arguably one of the ways that it could be answered is that one of the most valuable, precious things that we have in our possession is actually our soul. And, Jesus actually talks about this in Matthew 16:26, where he says, what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and yet forfeits his soul? So that if you were to gain everything that is to be offered on this side of eternity and you still end up forfeiting your soul, I think Jesus's understanding is that you would lose everything. And Charles Spurgeon kind of commented on this in a very similar fashion when he said, consider how precious a soul must be when both God and the devil are after it. So now I kind of want to lay out then, what is the soul? I think a lot of people have different understandings of the soul. And I think in today's modern day, I would say that a lot of people, when they think about the word soul, they might be led to think of the movie Soul. I don't know if you watch this movie, Ray, but it's a real treat. But the way that we understand soul is like this spirit-like immaterial substance that's kind of temporarily enclosed in this thing called the body until we pass on and it goes to some place of eternity, heaven, or whatever you might say. And I would say that this is not quite the biblical understanding of soul. This is actually more of a Greek influence or more Platonic in thought. It's more of a dualistic understanding of the soul. But when you look at the biblical understanding of what the soul is, that's more deeply rooted and influenced not only in the scripture, but in Jewish thought, it has a lot more of a holistic understanding of the soul. In fact, the Bible will probably say that the soul actually represents the whole person. And, if you look at the Bible Project, and they actually do this fascinating, short, insightful video on the Hebrew word nephesh, soul, this is basically the conclusion that they arrive at, that soul is not this immaterial spirit-like substance, but it is like the integration of all the key components that actually comprises and actually makes up a human person. I think the person that has probably most influenced my understanding of this is probably Dallas Willard. I think in his book, The Renovation of the Heart, he actually talks about this quite a bit. It's kind of one of the foundational chapters. He sort of lays out this paradigm as to what the soul is. And again, he sort of offers this definition where the soul is sort of the dimension of the person that interrelates, or I would even use the word integrates, all the key dimensions, parts or components that actually forms a single life or the whole person. And I guess that naturally then leads us to ask the question then, what are the key dimensions or parts or components that actually comprises the human soul? I think, again, borrowing from Willard here, I think he talks about three key components or parts. I think the first part is your spirit. He actually uses the word will, but he himself will probably say in the chapters of his books that the word will, heart, and spirit are sort of used interchangeably in the scripture. So, but for the sake of our discussion, I'm going to actually stick with the word spirit here. And the spirit is actually the most deepest part of who we are. Willard also says that it's also our control center. It's the thing that makes us human in the sense that it actually allows us to exercise dominion. Gives us the ability to choose. And he also says that, the spirit is a very powerful thing, but because of sin, it's also very terribly weak and limited. But we'll talk more about that a little bit later. I think the second key component of that comprises the human soul is what we will call the mind. And when we talk about the mind, we're not just talking about the seedbed of our thought life. We're talking about the emotions as well. I think one of the movies that really demonstrates this really well, as you can probably tell, I'm a big Pixar fan, and I haven't watched Inside Out 2, so forgive me if I don't have the most updated image. But when you look inside Riley's mind, you don't see a window into her thought life or to her memories, but you have a window and insight into these different emotions that actually controls her actions and her behaviors. And I think that's a very good understanding of what we mean by the mind here. It's the seedbed of our thoughts and also our emotions. Willard would also say that another key component that actually comprises the soul is actually our bodies as well. And again, the body is not this temporary enclosure that encloses our spirit and our mind. It is far more interconnected to our mind and our spirit than we might actually think. And we know this to be true because, like, if you guys experience anxiety, we don't just experience this in our body, right? Like, we don't just experience in our emotions where we feel the emotion of anxiety. We often have a somatic response, a bodily response, where we might get like sweaty palms, or we might feel like our stomach is being knotted up, or some of us maybe even report having chest pains, right? These are all ways that anxiety can kind of manifest sort of in the body. So again, it just shows that the body and the mind and the body and the spirit are far more interconnected than maybe what we might believe. And again, so the integration of all of these parts, the spirit, the mind, and the body, again, in this definition, is really what constitutes the whole person, or in this particular case, the human soul. And so I would say that that's probably the best way that I can try to answer that question. What is the soul? It is the integration of the spirit, the mind, and the body. And a healthy soul is when all three of those parts are actually working in conjunction with each other. We'll talk a little bit more about that a bit later in our webinar today. I think then when we look at the soul using this paradigm and this lens, and we go back to the question of, then what is soul care? Or in other words, how do you care for the soul? I think we have to look at it from this lens. We have to look at it from a more integrated, more holistic lens. So I would say that caring for the soul then obviously involves caring for our spirit, or tending to our life in the spirit. And many of us who are Christians are very familiar with this because our pastors, our churches talk a lot about how do we tend to our spiritual life, and some of the examples that I can probably show on the screen here is like, how do we engage in, how do we tend to our spirit? We engage in both personal and corporate expressions of worship, by engaging in the scripture, by engaging in different expressions of prayer, practicing silence and stillness and solitude, and even receiving spiritual care for others. And we talk about this a lot in the church. But what I probably would argue is that we don't talk a lot about in the church. I think we're actually making more headways thanks to you guys, people like AACC and webinar series like this, is that caring for our soul also involves caring for our minds. And caring for our mental and emotional health is actually an integral part of good soul care. And so, I think examples of this could be like journaling our thoughts and emotions, practicing gratitude, practicing mindfulness, or expressions of this like contemplative prayer, sharing with a friend, or sharing with your small group, confiding in your pastor or maybe a spiritual director, and even talking to a therapist and psychologist. Again, I would say, like, especially the last part that I put right there, oftentimes when we think of caring for our mind, we see that belonging simply to the realm of psychology and not theology. We only think of talking to a therapist or practicing, things that actually helps care for our mental health as only belonging to the realm of mental health and not soul health. But again, if we have a more of an integrated view of the human soul, a more holistic view of the human soul, we would be able to understand that caring for our minds by even talking to a therapist or a counselor is actually a good part of soul care regimen. I would even go as far as to say then caring for our soul then also involves caring for our bodies. I think one of the best examples of this when I look through the scriptures is Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 19, where he's in the wilderness of Beersheba. He's tired, he's burnt out, he's anxious, he's depressed, his soul is vexed. And God's remedy to Elijah's situation here, to his downcast soul, isn't just, hey, go and pray and fast more for 40 days. It's not that you have to just go back and engage him in the word. In fact, his treatment towards Elijah and the remedy that he brings to him is incredibly very physical. It's take a nap, Elijah. It's actually sleep. You need to drink water. You need to eat, and it's by that Elijah becomes strengthened. Because again, when you care for your body, it should have benefits that exceeds just the benefits of the body. It should help our minds. It should also help our spirit. Because again, all of those parts and pieces are integrated with each other. And so even from a scriptural example here in 1 Kings 19, you see that good soul care is really also, getting good sleep. It's exercising. It's taking good rest. In soul care and the formation lane, we have this joke. One of the best things that you can do to care for your soul is practice Napio Divina, and drink plenty of water and eat healthy, fasting, which is also a very physical way of bringing your body before God. And even taking medication when necessary. These are all good ways of how you can practice not only caring for your body, but again, caring for the whole soul. So again, I think in a full, more integrated, holistic definition, good soul care means tending to our spiritual health, our mental health, and our physical health as well. And so just wanted to kind of lay that as sort of the framework and foundation of all the things that we're going to be talking about today.
That's so helpful, so clear, and thank you so much for running us through all of that. I mean, because I do think that on the one hand, we do have a deficient understanding of our own being, and one of the most encouraging things that I see through the Heidelberg Catechism, for example, is like, what's your only comfort in life and death? Is that I am not my own, but in body and soul, life and death belong to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ.
Mm.
And there's something about us being fully integrated and comprehensive beings that that we can't bifurcate or dichotomize one part from the other, but actually help see the integration of all things. And thank you for doing that, to show that in proper soul care, you're caring for your mind, your emotional life, as well as your body and your physical life. And you know, as I think about, especially the context that we're engaged in, I wonder if you can speak into some of the unique challenges that might actually hinder Asian Americans from
Yeah.
being intentional about caring for their souls. I think that there's a lot of Asian Americans that we didn't have the luxury of soul care. And while we don't want to discard many of the beautiful things about our own cultural upbringings, we also want to move towards health in the areas that we need to. So I'm curious,
Mhm.
what would you speak into that on?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I love how you prefaced it by saying, most of my upbringing was in the Korean Heritage Church, Korean Immigrant Church. Most of my ministry context as a pastor was in that context, and so when I think about my upbringing, when I think about and for all the things that are so beautiful and sacred about that background, I would say soul care was primarily framed around just tending to our spirit, just prayer and obviously is being part of the Korean Immigrant Church. Early morning prayer was one of the primary ways that you tend to your soul. It's by engaging God in doing quiet times and engagement in scripture and worship, and all of those things are essential. I would never discard those things. But again, if we frame the soul as not just our spirit, but it's really the interconnectedness of the spirit, the mind, and the body, what happens when you are tending to your spirit, but you experience what we might call and frame as disintegration, where the body and the mind and the spirit are not really working healthily together, and your soul doesn't really feel healthy. And I experienced this actually firsthand back a few years ago, like in the thick of COVID. I remember I just came back from this personal retreat in Monterey. It was this beautiful, restful time, and I was washing my hands after I got back home after I had dinner with my family, and I just all of a sudden felt like I couldn't breathe. And so, naturally, I just thought, oh, I must have gotten COVID while I was on this personal retreat. I ran out of the house and I'm looking at my Apple Watch, and my heart rate is just going from like 120, 130, 140. My not only is my heart racing, my thoughts are racing, and I'm thinking like, oh my God, I think I got COVID. I'm probably gonna have sent to the ER. I'll probably get intubated. I'm probably gonna die. Like it was just like 0 to 60, and so I'm like panicking. And so I called my wife and I was like, hey, I think I need to quarantine. And she's like, what are you talking about? I had you test like 3 times before I had you come back home. And my wife, by the way, she's a psychologist in training. She's at the Rosemary School of Psychology. And she's listening to me and she's like, oh, I don't think you're having COVID. I think it's something else. I need you to come back home before you pass out somewhere in the neighborhood. And so I come back home, I have my mask and my gloves on and everything. And she takes me upstairs. She pulls out her DSM-5 and she's like going down the list of symptoms about panic disorder, panic attacks. And I'm like, what? Like me? No, no, that can't be me. Even though I had like 10 out of the 13 symptoms. And I was like, no, that can't be me, And I'm like, I'm not anxious. I just came back from the most relaxing weekend. And long story made short, I mean, I ended up going to the doctor's office, doing blood work and everything. And after about 2 weeks in denial, I came to the conclusion, obviously, that what I was experiencing was panic attacks. And it didn't stop within those 2 weeks. I actually ended up having it for an additional, I would say, 4 to 5 weeks or over just a little over a month. And that was a time where I was like, wait a second. If you looked at my inner life with God, like I had a regular rhythm of prayer, of practicing silence and solitude and being engaged in the word and having journaling, having quiet times, like all of these things. But yet I just felt like my soul was in such disarray. I mean, I was experiencing disintegration to its fullest. And it just comes to show that your spiritual life, you could be tending to that with due diligence. But if there are other aspects of your soul, namely in my case, it was the mind and my body that was experiencing unhealth, it's going to affect your soul and it's going to affect your overall experience of health in the soul. So, I just didn't have a grid or framework for this because of the background that I grew up in. And so I think having more of a holistic understanding or framework of the soul, because in that moment I was kind of like really confused, and some people are led kind of, down pathways where they feel, overburdened with guilt or maybe shame or something, what's wrong with me. So I do think that for Asian Americans, especially if they grew up in a primarily like an Asian heritage church, having this kind of help, more holistic understanding of the soul and soul care can be very, very helpful in terms of, practicing good soul care. So yeah, that's one thing that I probably would share.
Yeah, and thanks for sharing that. It's reminding me of a friend in Minnesota. He's Hmong, and we were sharing about the different experiences that we had growing up. I'm Korean, you're Korean, Jeff. But he was talking about like the Hmong experience, which is primarily a refugee experience for a large portion of the population, especially in the U.S. And he was telling me about how poor of a job our churches did in giving us language that helps reflect our internal realities
Mm,
when you see it's so rich within scripture.
yeah,
And one of the things that he mentioned was his mom, who basically said, I'm just feeling like something is going on. And he's like, everything you're saying sounds like you're having an anxiety attack.
yeah,
And she's
yeah,
like, no, I'm not an anxious person. I'm not supposed to be anxious. The Bible calls us
yeah,
not to worry in
yeah.
prayer and supplication, present all things before the Lord.
Right,
And
right.
so, and I do think, that that prayer is the best antidote for worry and anxiety. I don't
Hmm.
think that we are ever intended to carry as much of the uncertainty as we're, as this world is throwing at us. And so we should never be without prayer. But there are times when there are things that we are engaged in, the rhythms of our life that are uh just just too much for us to handle,
Hmm.
that it requires us to even step out of the context that we're in if we're able. And as he asked her, how do you how do you feel, describe what's going on, and she basically said that it feels like there's a kettle in her chest that's boiling and
Mm,
overflowing and burning her chest. And
mm,
he was like, Mom, that sounds like an anxiety attack.
mm,
And for her, she's like, oh my gosh, do I have anxiety? But then does that mean my faith is weak? What does that mean? And so she had this little existential crisis in her own life at that moment. But to your point, I think when we operate uh, in such a disintegrated model, where we bifurcate our body from our mind from our soul, and our emotional life, what we end up having is a dysfunctional understanding of ourselves, that doesn't actually help us understand that help us move forward in our lives. And so thanks for sharing your own story. I know
yeah.
that I'm still trying to connect with my own emotions. Like that's something I'm
Hmm.
actively doing
Hmm.
with my therapist, who's helping me get in touch. And there's whole lots of reasons why there's all forms of dissociation taking place in my own life, and then they're neurologically divergent realities. But let's try to get a little practical, right?
Mm,
Because on the one hand, my big concern is that a lot of the spiritual formation industry right now,
yeah,
it's based off of this kind of commitment to individual autonomy, which is actually leading towards more and more secularization in our society, because we were
yeah,
getting more and more untethered from communal ways of being, communal
yeah,
ways of relating, communal rhythms. And we're primarily, these are, a lot of the spiritual formation industry is about engaging people to engage with their inward lives with
hmm,
private practices, without helping them engage with broader communities that can help
yeah,
kind of regulate in relationship. and and I think it's leading to a significant level of kind of I'm spiritual but not religious.
hmm, hmm, hmm,
It's a me and Jesus faith. I don't need the
yeah,
church. I do church everywhere else except for within the community of Christ. Um, can you speak to that, and then
yeah,
also speak to what are some of the things that, I mean, especially as Asian Americans, we're culturally and inherently communal in our in our beings. We're culturally collective in our disposition, and yet many within the US start adopting an individualistic kind of approach to life, including spirituality. And so like I do see that in the Bible. We have an individual kind of uh, responsibility and role. We have communal responsibility, and then we have societal responsibilities and roles. But when
Yeah.
it comes to spiritual formation, what does that look like?
Yeah. I'm so glad that you're bringing this up because, again, if I'm just even Willard, when he actually gives out his paradigm of the soul, he actually puts relationships, the social aspect as being an integral function of, good soul care. And I think for the sake of our discussion, I had left that part out. But as you're bringing this up, it's bringing me back to a lot of conversations that I've been having with leaders in the soul care space. I think a lot of us are actually recognizing that soul care is becoming very privatized, individualized, and kind of in the loneliness epidemic. I think one of the primary drivers that's exacerbating, some of the experiences that people are having with depression and anxiety is that it's people are very disconnected, and experiencing loneliness. And so it's like, how do we bring some balance to this? Because when you look at a lot of the monastic orders, like from the Benedictines, to the Franciscans, when you look at a lot of these orders that had sort of a rule of life, it was not individual. It was actually very communal based. They actually practiced a lot of these sacred rhythms, not just individually in their own cell, but they actually practiced it together as a community. And so I think, like conversations that I have with someone like John Mark Comer, I think they are picking up on this. And I know that Practicing the Way, even for their pastors conference this year, they're really trying to bring more of a healthy theology of what formation communally looks like, and then perhaps offering some practical remedies to do that. But I would think of just like an example of this is like Sabbath. A lot of us, we kind of have the mindset of like, you do you, right? Like you do what works for you. But I wonder like what practicing Sabbath would look like communally, where maybe you and your small group gather together on a Friday night. You light a candle. You don't have to do that, but you can have a really wonderful meal, have some meaningful conversations, kind of power down your digital devices to kind of start the beginning of your Sabbath, which will go on through sundown Saturday. And what would it look like for us to be able to do that? Because I think the stickiness of whether we actually stay in these practices, it's very hard if you're going to do it alone. And like us doing it alone and just coming back for accountability, even that too is a little bit hard. But what if we can experience prayer collectively together? What if we can have very intimate moments of worship collectively together? What if we can practice Sabbath together? And I think some of these more corporate communal expressions of experiencing the grace of these sacred practices, I think is kind of the future that I would love to see churches sort of carve and do. And in some ways, they are doing this on a Sunday gathering level and maybe through small groups. But I would just love to see a little bit more intentionality around this, because I like you, am kind of seeing the fact that as society is becoming more fragmented, I don't think the answer is just having more fragmented ways of approaching these spiritual practices. I think the answer is really found in the church, through our spiritual communities and families, and having an shared experience of these sacred rhythms together.
Yeah, no, that's such a great and response, and I totally agree. I mean, when I was working at a Christian college, one of the things I would encourage people to do is all their spiritual practices to do them together. And so it meant that it looked a lot more like the Korean church than the white mega church, right? So the only
Interesting,
time
right?
that they can get time was early in the morning. And so they decided that at 6:30 in the morning, a group of 10 to 15 kids would walk together into a room and then read the Bible both
Mm,
collectively, individually together, and then go to breakfast. But you can't do that in a busy college setting, in the middle of the day. So you have to do what the immigrant Koreans did and do it early in the morning. And they would spend time praying together. And so,
mm,
like, I find myself very encouraged when, especially second generation Asian American churches, continue on those legacies. But
yeah.
it's oftentimes it oftentimes emerges out of pragmatic means and a desire to preserve the heritage, but it's also contextualized to the newer generational realities. And so like I completely agree. I to be honest, I'm very concerned at the direction of the spiritual formation kind of industry, because I've seen, as much help as I've received from people like Dallas Willard, you know, I've also found that uh the relational emphases that he has was strong with the interpersonal, but it was weak with
Mm.
the communal.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
and just by living and kind of being raised in and consuming the air of Western individualism in a society of in a Western society, like it's hard to break out of the mindset. And I think one of the best things that happened for me was both being raised in the immigrant church and having lived in Korea, where
mm,
the differences were subtle, but they were significant. And you
mm,
understood that you felt a responsibility for other people and to other people in ways that you don't often feel here. You often
yeah,
feel a obligation to other people and for other people here. And if you do feel an obligation, it doesn't often translate towards like a sense of joyful responsibility, which I got a greater sense of, because the
mm,
community is a assumed reality, whereas here it's a reality that we have to work towards, unless it's like our nuclear family, and if our nuclear family is kind of intact.
yeah,
um your last suggestion was extremely helpful, where you
mm,
said like do these things in, in community together. I think that gives a picture of like what spiritually formative practices could look like in community. I love that you emphasize the meal. I encourage people only to use candles that don't have parabens in them. And then I encourage people to to have, to share in conversation. But what are some other things? Both let's break it down in this way. What are some individual things, because we all still have to do things on our own? What are some
yeah,
interpersonal things that you can do, either if you're married with your spouse or your partner, or with your family if you have kids, or with a group of friends, or with your roommates, uh,
yeah,
and with communities? And then I think the next question I want to ask you, and to kind of tee up in your mind, is the church today, especially the 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 English speaking side of immigrant churches, or second gen plus um, Asian American churches, are they oriented towards a type of communal spiritual formation?
mm.
So let's do
Okay,
the individual
that's a good,
practices,
yeah,
interpersonal. Yeah.
and we'll jump into the church question. Yeah, yeah, really, really great questions here, and I would say like individually, again, oftentimes when we think about a spiritual practice, we only think of it as benefiting the spirit, right? But what if there was ways to sort of reimagine these practices again, because we're very integrated beings. And I think the benefits would not just apply to our spirit, but it could apply to our bodies, and it can also apply to our thought life and our emotional life, right? And so, like one of the ways that growing up in the Korean American church, and again, I love the expressions of prayers that I got to experience there. When I was working as a staff at my previous church for 15 years, one of my favorite places to go pray was in the main sanctuary. It was more often than not after early morning prayer services. It was quiet in there. So maybe during the afternoon time, I would go in there for a holy nap, or I would go in there for prayer. And, it was prayer for me was very stationary. It was very quiet. It was very indoors. And I think, as I've come to sort of discover, like, man, these days, when I engage movement, when I incorporate movement into my prayer life, so for example, when I go out for a walk and when I'm out in nature and I have these trails, kind of like, outdoor trails. I live in Fullerton where there's a bunch of trails, and I'm just seeing like the sun come up. I hear the birds chirping. It's like so sensory, and I'm just so filled with delight, and I realize that whenever I'm moving my bodies, it actually helps me to engage my mind before God. And therefore, it actually leads to, more often than not, more of an enlivened experience of God. So like now, like part of my rule of life is just to kind of go out for these morning walks. If I'm not going out for a run, usually after my run, I'll just kind of take a few moments just to cool down and just be outdoors and move my body and just walk and just allow myself to experience God in that way. And so prayer looks very different for me, at least in this season of my life. But I'm sure that there might be seasons where I might go back to more the indoor quiet reflection. My sanctuary might look different, you know? And so that's just an example of one thing that I can see that shows that you can still engage your body and your mind and your spirit and do it in a very integrated, holistic way. I think the practice of Sabbath is probably another one, you know, like again, whether you choose to do it individually or corporately, Sabbath could be a day of rest, you know, for our bodies, you know, but usually on my Sabbath, you know, I like to go out for like a good run, you know, and that helps sort of like release all the anxiety and stress that's been stored up in my body. Um, and usually I like to have like an extended, you know, journaling session. I love to read a book or do something that fills my soul with delight, you know, or my spirit with delight. And you know, it's a very integrated way. Sabbath isn't just for our spirit; it's for our bodies, it's for our minds. So again, a lot of these spiritual practices, even though we may conventionally think of them or frame them around like, oh, this is just for the mind or this is just for the body, as you mentioned, we are whole beings. You know, we're very integrated people. And so the benefit that exercise has is not just to our bodies, it's definitely scientifically shown. It actually has a way of showing benefits in terms of our mental health, our emotional health. And I think it also helps our spiritual health as well. So that's probably something that, you know, maybe two examples of some spiritual practices that are both could be individual or corporate that I would probably want to, you know, offer up here as an example. I think that question of like, you know, our churches, are we functioning as like formational communities? I do want to say that I do think churches are um, doing formation, you know, in their own right. I think each Sunday gathering, I think there is something still very sacred and special about the people of God coming together, engaging in corporate worship, you know, listening to the word, you know, responding to God in prayer. I think this is formational. Over time, I think it is very formational. I think when I think about our churches, then, you know, helping establish, you know, communities that are actually formational in the sense of they're helping people engage in some of these expressions or some of these sacred rhythms more corporately, or maybe in the context of these intimate communities, say like your small groups. I still feel like there's some work that needs to be done there, you know? And I still love the fact that a small group, you know, you will talk about a passage of scripture or the fact that you'll talk about the previous week's sermon. But yeah, I would just love to see, just like the example that I gave earlier, like what would it look like for us to, you know, experience the table together, experience the beginning of Sabbath together? What would it look like for us to do like a digital fast together? Like I would love to see more of those sort of expressions kind of, you know, being integrated into the church. And I think one thing that could also help is just having more of a holistic framework, you know, and I think churches, because they've had to respond more to the mental health crisis that we've been seeing, especially even as it comes down to our congregation, we are talking about some of these things more often than not, but I still feel like there's still some work that needs to be done there. And so that's probably, you know, maybe one of the first shots that I would probably take in answering that question. Yeah.
No, that's good. You know, one of the things that someone asked the question, and is more a comment than a question, but I think this is really salient and relevant, because a lot of she writes, in theory, I love the idea of communal spiritual formation, but I think we need to address the fact that church communities have caused a lot of trauma and that so many people are leaving institutional churches to practice their faith individually in reaction to this. I don't think most churches have really taken ownership of how abusive they've been and taken corrective action. I think that's a really kind of important thing to name and to address, especially because I think, you know, to your point, like we are constantly being formed by everything. I mean, I like when my wife and I went to Cuba, it's amazing how not having advertising signs all up in your face 24/7, everywhere you drive, everywhere you go,
Wow.
how that shapes and forms you. Like I don't feel like for the first time, I think that was the first thing we noticed, is that we don't feel like someone's selling something at us or trying to
Mm,
communicate an unnecessary message. And yet, because of our digital devices, where there people are constantly trying to grab our attention, eh, all of these things continue to shape and form habits in us that can be for good as well as be for our harm. But what do you do when, one, like we're in a context where, in the US, because of people like Willard and others, like spiritual formation has become hyper individualistic, right? Individualized. Like it's almost the relational and the communal parts are given a nod to, but then they're not really fleshed out. And everything is about how I really kind of develop a rule of life for myself and I stick to it, where there are habits that I'm being formed in, and then I'm following through on those habits. And then where church comes in is like a secondary measure to that, even though they would articulate the importance of it. But churches themselves are not oriented around communal formation, right? They're oriented
mhm,
around hearing from from an expert,
mhm.
downloading information, growing your mind and your knowledge base, and then kind of going out and doing your own thing, maybe serving together, maybe eating together, maybe this or that together. um, but there are a lot of people that have been hurt by the church and traumatized by the church. What do we need to do, or what do
Mm,
churches need to do in light of that? And what can individuals who have been hurt by the church do,
yeah,
especially if they're trying to stay Christian
yeah.
and don't know how to do that because every church they've been to has been so disappointing at the very least?
It's a great question. I was on a call yesterday with actually our mutual friend David and a few other pastors, and we've been kind of engaged in this like 3 session dialogue about when we're thinking about training and developing leaders for the church or for the local church, like what are some of the core essential things that we would want to equip and train people on? And I think collectively as a whole, all of us arrived at this understanding that what I think the church needs is like, how do we, right now, especially in this season, coming out of COVID, coming out of all the things that we're sort of seeing as far as mental health, church abuse, trauma, pain, like how do we train people just to be sacred companions for the journey? Like, how do you actually help people to attend to people and be present with people in their experience of pain, and not offer and remedy. And this is very true of my Asian experience. Is like the way that you practice spiritual care to someone was you just try to fix. And sometimes, a lot of times, that was not very helpful. And I would imagine that the person that asked the question, that perhaps maybe some of us, especially when we're in a season of deep loss or deep grief or pain or experience of shame or brokenness, like that doesn't prove to be healthy at all. And so, like, how do we companion people? How do we come alongside them? How do we listen? How do we hold space for them? This is something that I feel like the church really needs more training in. And because maybe as to the point that you raised, we think that maybe spiritual formation is on Sundays, we see a person, giving answers to us or talking to us, from the scripture, maybe small group leaders or other people, when someone is sharing something really tender and vulnerable, that's sort of what we are led to think is the most helpful response. But oftentimes, that's not the case. And so I think, even just retraining people of like, what does it mean to companion someone, even through their experience of pain or trauma or abuse? And, one of those churches is actually, trying to bring in this model of trauma informed care, to at least the leaders of their congregation. And I love the fact that they're actually doing this. I believe he's probably a mutual friend, Dave Wang, who's from Fuller. They are, and I love the fact that you're trying to train and equip leaders in doing this. And so I do think that there's a lot. We are talking about it more, but we also need practices and we need training and modalities that could help the church and its leadership to sort of walk people through that. So that's one of the first things that comes to mind. But yeah, I just think, when I was going through my wall experience, the most helpful thing to me was for someone to sit with me, not give all the answers and not explain why I was going through what I was going through, but just listen. and just even in that, helped me to process my experience, and when the moment was right, offer maybe an insight that would sort of help me in my state of despair or confusion. And that was such a gift to me, not only in that season, but I would say that's a gift to me even now. And so I would love to see more of that, as part of a way for churches to become more formational and more healthy, especially as it relates to caring for others who um, are part of that community.
No, that's good. I have two more questions that
Mhm.
I'm getting in. One is uh, someone asked, how do you incorporate these practices in the workplace? Because sometimes I feel burned out as I'm expected to physically be in the office 4 times a week. Like, what do you do when your work demands more of you than you have margin to, than the margin that you have, right? And then let's say that you can't create margin because of the work that you have and that you're responsible to.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really great question. And again, I mean, even for us in the ministry landscape, it's like, it's ironic because like even as you're having to prepare sermons or Bible studies, these things actually sometimes take you away from your life with God. It's like we get so inundated in doing a life for God, like we sort of neglect our life with God aspect. And I think, again, a lot of this sort of had to sort of kind of break my paradigm of what the spiritual life is like. And, somewhat like the helpful books that have helped me sort of reframe my spirituality is like, um, our books like God in My Everything, Ken Shigematsu. Like, I think he helps sort of, what does it look like to construct the rule of life when you have very busy, fast-paced lives? And that was a very short, helpful book. But I would say it's like, being present with God, even while you're at work. And again, this is far more easy said than done. So whether it's on your commute, and you are taking moments of worship, private worship in the car, or you're listening to a sermon that's on your way there, or maybe during after a quiet lunch break, you're just able to kind of practice what they do in like the Benedictine community, where they have these 5 times throughout the day where they just stop everything that they're doing, and just for a brief moment, whenever this bell rings, they just bring all of their mind, their attention, their body just before God and just being present with Him. So, oftentimes when we think of spiritual practices, we feel like we're always going after the home run or the extraordinary. But I think, incorporating ways that sort of brings God into the everyday, ordinary moments of life, commutes, morning coffees, maybe some quiet moments and times, maybe after a lunch break or even the drive home, would probably be just, my more simple answer to that question, is just trying to incorporate God into all of the rhythms and all the responsibilities in the days of that you have to engage in your day-to-day life.
So let's tangibilize that, right? And so what does that actually look like? What does it look like to incorporate God into your commute or into your coffee run, right? And I just started drinking coffee. So like
Wow.
I'm still trying to figure all that stuff out. Coffee is a new world for me. But like, what like when you do that, what do you exactly mean by that?
Yeah. And so again, let me just kind of demystify this is like, sometimes what I would do after a lunch break, like instead of going straight to my office and pounding away at the sermon that I'm working on, I would just take a moment just to kind of go outside. Maybe I'll do like a 5-10 minute walk. And as I'm walking, I'm just trying to bring my attention before the Lord. And I'm just trying to be mindful of, okay, where am I in this? Where is he in this? And it could just be a simple way of just in those 5 to 10 minutes of engaging God in that moment. Again, I know that even during the morning commutes, um, it could be maybe not listening to a sermon or what I said earlier, having a private moment of worship that someone had just told me that that's kind of been their way as for how they fill their cup. But it could just be taking something that you had a thought about from the night before, something that you were processing, or maybe you were journaling about. But even as you're driving, you're just continuing to ruminate on that thought or that idea. So it's about just trying to bring God in the everyday movements of day-to-day life, rather than always trying to structure like a whole nother set of time to engage in. So that's kind of the model that I'm trying to offer. Um, I would say like those are some more ways that I would try to ground it in reality. Yeah.
Mhm. No, that's really helpful. I mean, one of the things I often like try to do is because I try to articulate it to people where it's like it feels like my mind is in one place, my heart is somewhere else, and my body is where it is.
Mm,
And if I can slow down even for like a minute, and
yeah.
it's remarkable how much, like just learning how to breathe properly
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
or to pray through your breath. And there's a whole kind of movement of breath prayers that are out there that all you have to do
Yeah.
is look that up.
Yeah.
Um, how that can really center you and then let your mind catch up to your body or your body catch up to your mind and your
Yes.
your emotions to kind of find an equilibrium where then you can say, okay, here I am. Let me just do a quick inventory, breathe in deeply a few times, and then say, okay, where am I?
Yeah.
What is going through my mind? Why
Right.
am I feeling this way? Am
Yeah.
I reacting in a way that's consistent with what I see God calling me through the Beatitudes or through the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians? And then to then start inviting God, or to, as you were saying, bring God into the everyday or into the ordinary aspects of
Mm,
life.
yeah.
I feel like until we can get those three parts of us all together, like the heart, the mind, and the body all together,
Yeah.
it becomes really difficult to like engage
Mm,
with God in a meaningful way, because I can go through the motions of prayer, but if my
yeah.
mind is somewhere else, I can
Or
speak
else.
all the prayers in my mind that are
Mm,
out there, but my
mm,
my attention is really elsewhere. And so I personally found that like things like slowing down to breathe is really helpful. That like doing a self inventory, and there's like a few questions that I'm regularly asking myself,
yeah.
so that I try not to overreact or not to underreact to certain things.
Yeah.
And then asking, okay, where am I in relation to God? And sometimes even imagining where God is in the
Hmm.
room and why I see God in that light, if I see God behind me or in front of me and things of that nature. But it's often helpful when you're doing it in friendship or in relationship, and then like other people are asking you because you have like a common vocabulary and a common kind
Mm,
of system that you're working through.
yeah.
Last question.
Yeah.
um your story of disintegration, someone said that I appreciate your story of disintegration when anxiety arose. What practical advice do you have for someone going through anxiety who doesn't know where to start first in caring for their soul? And then
Mm,
at what point do you go seek professional help, right? So
mm,
what's incumbent upon the individual? Where do we look for friendships or even pastoral or kind of communal care, spiritual care? And then when do we need to go and say, I need a therapist or a psychiatrist to help me with this?
yeah. That's a really, really great question. And I really appreciate, just the insights that you provided on that last point. Because yeah, breath prayer is like it's probably central to my experience of prayer right now. Um, Especially, having grown up in the Korean American church, like prayer was very loud and expressive. But now prayer is a lot more quiet. It's a lot more contemplative. And sometimes, what kind of helps center you and kind of ground you is just to even slow down your breathing, right? So, really, really appreciate your insights on that. I think, when my experience, sort of the disintegration when I was having these anxiety attacks, my primary experience in that moment was I felt shame. I felt, like what's wrong with me? I felt a lot of denial. I was like, oh, this must be hypoglycemia. I was, when you do your Google web search, I was coming up with all these medical explanations. The one thing that I was in absolute denial about was that this was, a panic attack. So I would say that I think having a wife, obviously, who had some knowledge in this and who was just able to attend to me and just to be able to say, like, it's okay, you know? And I remember this was like my second stint back in therapy. Before I went in, like I was feeling all this tightness. I was feeling all this anxiety because, as a pastor and a leader, whenever I find myself on the other side of the chair, it's like it's a very interesting experience. But I just say all that because it's really okay to talk to people that could help normalize your experience, that could actually help bring acceptance. Because again, for a lot of not just Asian American Christians, but I would say for a lot of people, when they experience this kind of disintegration, I think naturally we're led down to pathways where we experience incredible shame or guilt or maybe even denial. And so I think just having people to hold that space for us, again, this is again where I feel like the church can do a lot more work, but reaching out to specific people who are confidants to just be able to share this with and just say, okay, hey, who could sort of normalize this? That was incredibly helpful for me. And in that particular moment, because, I was still in denial, even though my wife was like, hey, I think this is more than just any physical ailment or illness that you're having here. It was really my therapist that really helped me to understand and sort of start unpacking and processing, why I might be experiencing these things. A huge part of for me was a lot of delayed grief, um, and a lot of just primary emotions that I had stuffed. And it was a long, slow process. Therapy is not a quick fix type of thing. It's more like a dance, and layer by layer, we just kind of took parts at it. And so I think this is really where professionals are very well equipped and trained to sort of help get through the layers of maybe what has surfaced or what has manifested, whether it's a form of anxiety attack or not. And so I wholeheartedly support just reaching out to professionals when maybe talking to a friend or maybe talking to your pastor. It's helpful, but you still feel like there needs to be more support that's there. Wholeheartedly, I would say I would encourage people to reach out to a therapist or a psychologist to sort of, and even medication. I think reading Archibald Hart's understanding of like anxiety, and his kind of like classification of how the anti-anxiety medications sort of help and how they sort of work in the body was incredibly helpful for me. And so so whether that's even a trip to a psychiatrist, right? So I do think that professionals are trained to be able to help work through these layers, but it also doesn't mean that we just reach out to professionals too, but we also have to reach out to our support systems that we also have in place. So yeah.
That's good. And for anyone that's listening in, I think that it's really important to know that getting help does not make you someone that is a person who lacks faith. I think that that's
Hmm.
pretty pervasive within the Christian community, as well as specifically within the Asian American Christian community, that when you're looking for medication, and I'm on ADHD medication, and so I just was diagnosed late in life because all of the stigma surrounding like mental health and neurodivergence was just real, and I was like, there's something that certainly needs to change, and so went to a psychiatrist and started ADHD medication, trying to figure out how do you navigate all that. And so know that it's not a lack of faith. With that said, we got to wrap up. Jeff, so grateful for this time. If people want to connect with you, how do they find you? How do they connect with you? You do pastors, you do work with pastors around spiritual formation. Well, tell us about how to connect there, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, you can look more into our ministry, Barnabas Co, at barnabasandco.org. Again, as Ray mentioned at the beginning of our webinar today, we did launch a 5-month soul care initiative or experience for Asian American pastors called Journey of Wholeness, and you can find more information about that at journeyofwholeness.org. And so we're not, really active on social media, but you can also look us up there at Barnabas Co, and also Journey of Wholeness. So those are our 2 Instagram handles. And yeah, look forward to having future conversations with you down the line.
Well, thank you all for tuning in. Thank you, Jeff, for such a wonderful discussion and presentation. I hope that it continues to spur people towards engaging with a more profound and healthier way of being in this absurd life and world that we live in. Thank you all for
Well
tuning in,
said.
and join us for the next one. We're looking forward to our next conversation in August. Have a wonderful day.